My name is Anne Bayefsky, and I am the director of the Turo Institute on Human Rights in the Holocaust and president of Human Rights Voices. In some respects, today's event is 20 years in the making. 20 years ago, the enemies of the Jewish people were given a powerful weapon of global proportions, a United Nations World Conference, ostensibly to combat racism. The gathering in Durban, South Africa, for all nations, as well as thousands of members of civil society and non-governmental organizations, became a festival of hate directed at one people and their nation, the Jewish people. Participants, both governmental and non-governmental, made the calculated decision to demonize, exclude, and isolate Jews and the state of Israel. For some, it was their primary goal. For others, placated by results on different issues, such an outcome was an acceptable price to be paid, a legitimate sacrifice on the altar of multilateralism. Against all odds, however, the Durban Gambit failed. The hypocrisy of building equality rights on the inequality of the Jewish few was exposed. The United States, led by Republican African-American Secretary of State and a Democratic member of Congress who was a Holocaust survivor, understood the noxious threat to world order and to human rights and refused to legitimize it. The United States, along with Israel, walked out of the Durban Conference. And then what happened? I myself moved to New York directly from the Durban Conference on September the 9th, 2001. No one who experienced both the torrent of intolerance at the UN's Durban Conference and the devastation of 9/11 in New York City could fail to connect the dots between hate mongering and incitement and violence. And yet, here we are, 20 years later, mourning 9/11, while the United Nations celebrates the Durban Conference and its deceitful declaration. Why? Because, in fact, this story dates back even further. It traces back to 1948, when after the modern Jewish state was established in defiance of the infernos of the Holocaust, the racists and anti-Semites regrouped. They revised human history and revamped the lexicon of human progress. Zionists became Nazis, anti-Semitism became a fiction, human wrongs became human rights, and the United Nations became a global platform for Holocaust deniers, sponsors of terrorism, bigots, and some of the most egregious human rights abusers ever. Discrediting the first Durban Conference was, therefore, not the end of the story. Led by its top human rights official in 2009, the United Nations sponsored a second Global Racism Conference to revive and reaffirm the first, and still another conference in 2011 on the 10th anniversary of the original gathering. This year, the United Nations seeks once again to reaffirm and regurgitate Durban's lethal legacy, to revitalize what was and remains a tool of destruction. Our task today, therefore, is to continue to defy the odds, to expose the deceit, the double talk, the double standards, and in particular, the discrimination. Thank you to the inspiring and courageous men and women from whom you are about to hear. Together, they have a singular message for the haters and dividers. Fight racism, not Jews. His Excellency Ambassador Gilad Erdan is Israel's ambassador to the United States and the United Nations. Prior to assuming his dual role, Ambassador Erdan served in the Israeli Knesset for 17 years and held several ministerial positions, including Minister of Public Security and Minister of Strategic Affairs, where he led the fight against the attempts to delegitimize the State of Israel. Ambassador Erdan has also been a prominent voice in the fight against anti-Semitism around the world and has led the diplomatic campaign both in Washington and at the UN to encourage countries to refuse to participate in the UN's commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the Durban Conference. It's a great privilege to have you with us today.
Thank you for that introduction, Anne. And it's really a pleasure to be here with you today. Anti-Semitism has evolved, grown more complex, and adopted new guises. In more recent times, it is expressing itself in attempts to delegitimize the right of Israel to exist, including calls for its destruction. These words were spoken not by an Israeli diplomat or a pro-Israel organization, but by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, exactly 3 years ago, in September 2018. Yet this week, the UN will hold a commemoration of the 2001 World Conference Against Racism, the Durban Conference, where anti-Jewish racism adopted the guise of anti-racism, thereby making anti-Semitism not only morally legitimate, but morally required. As Holocaust survivor and US Congressman Tom Lantos, who led the US delegation to Durban, declared, "For me, having experienced the horrors of the Holocaust firsthand, this was the most sickening hate for Jews I had seen since the Nazi period." And in the words of then UN Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson, there was horrible anti-Semitism present, particularly in some of the NGO discussions. The radical anti-Semitism of the Durban NGO Forum has been well documented. The signs praising Hitler, the sale of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the violent harassment of Jewish delegates, and the outrageous language describing Israel as an apartheid state guilty of genocide. However, while these are shocking enough and should suffice for any moral country to disassociate itself from this shameful event, it is important to highlight the more subtle anti-Semitism of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. The DDPA was adopted by the state parties at the UN-sponsored gathering, and according to the UN, is the most authoritative and comprehensive program for combating racism. The DDPA contains a 44-paragraph long sanction listing victims of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. The section is largely made up of broad categories: people of African and Asian descent, indigenous peoples, migrants, women, and children. In only one case is a specific national conflict named. Not the conflicts involving true examples of widespread racist atrocities like Darfur or Rwanda, but rather the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In the section on victims of racism, the DDPA states, "We are concerned about the plight of the Palestinian people under foreign occupation." While this inclusion is more subtle than the signs outside the UN Forum branding Israel an apartheid state, it does three insidious things. One, it makes clear that if the Palestinians are victims of racism, their oppressor, i.e. Israel, must be a racist regime. Two, since it is the sole national conflict to be included, it communicates that the racism against the Palestinians is the worst example of racism in a national conflict anywhere in the world. And finally, it conveys the message that if you support the goals of the DDPA, you must view the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through the lens of anti-racism. The language of the DDPA, and of course, the Festival of Anti-Semitic Hate alongside the UN Forum, were sins of commission. But there were many sins of omission or silence as well. Too many countries failed to speak out strongly. Far too many so-called human rights organizations failed to intervene or even took part in the incitement. Too many continued to play along with the farce of Durban, even as its follow-up events featured Iranian President Ahmadinejad's Holocaust denial. In failing to stand up and speak out, these countries and organizations not only encouraged the delegitimization of Israel, but legitimized violence against Jewish communities everywhere under the banner of the crusade against Israel's so-called racist regime. A direct line connects Durban and the wave of anti-Semitic incidents we have seen over the past several years, and especially this past May during Operation Guardian of the Walls. Those who stayed silent when anti-Israel activists called on Hitler to finish the job cannot pretend to be shocked when anti-Israel activists assault Jews on the streets or called to rape Jewish women. A direct line connects the legitimizing of anti-Semitic tropes at Durban to the mainstreaming of those same tropes by certain members of Congress. And a direct line connects the exclusion of Israel from the fight against racism to the attempts by BDS to exclude Jewish students from progressive spaces. Omar Barghouti himself has said that Durban was a main trigger for the BDS call. As the grandchild of Auschwitz survivors, I do not like to make comparisons to the Holocaust. I will not say that Durban was like Kristallnacht or later Nazi atrocities, but I'm reminded of a lesser known event in Nazi history. 1 year before Kristallnacht, in November 1937, Joseph Goebbels opened the anti-Semitic exhibition, Der ewige Jude, the eternal Jew, at the library of the German Museum in Munich. This exhibit conveyed anti-Semitic messages in the most sophisticated and woke style of the era, blaming Jews for the spread of communism and the corruption of Aryan values. This exhibit, viewed by over 400,000 visitors, helped convey the message that Jew hatred wasn't just acceptable, but something that every enlightened person should adopt. In some ways, Durban was the Der ewige Jude exhibit of the new anti-Semitism. Therefore, friends, it matters little what will actually be said on September 22nd at Durban 4, or whether or not Israel will explicitly be mentioned. The Durban process is rotten to its core, and any of its follow-up events and the fruits are the fruits of a poisonous tree. An anti-Semitic hate fest, no matter how noble or important its original goals, shouldn't be commemorated accept as a tragic error never to be repeated. This does not mean that we should in any way lessen our commitment to the fight against racism. In fact, the Jewish people in Israel must be at the forefront of this fight. Nothing could be more natural than the descendants of slavery and the descendants of millennia of anti-Semitic persecution joining hands to combat discrimination and the dehumanization. The American Jewish community is rightly proud of its role in the civil rights movement. And Israel too must continue to work tirelessly to eliminate all manifestation of racism in its society and be a clear moral voice in the international arena against all forms of racial hate. Our demand that countries refuse to participate in the Durban process does not in any way contradict what must be our equally strong demand to speak up against racism wherever it appears. Dear friends, much has changed since 2001. Today, the Jewish and pro-Israel community is more organized and better prepared. Groups and leaders like those who have organized and are participating in this conference are playing a key role in revealing the rotten roots and poisonous fruits of the Durban process and putting the fight against anti-Semitism on the global agenda. Tragically, it is also becoming harder and harder for political leaders to deny the direct link between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism due to the rise in anti-Semitic attacks. Political leaders are realizing that their failure to take an active stance against this new anti-Semitism is directly endangering their local Jewish communities. As a result, we have seen an unprecedented number of states declare that they will not take part in Durban 4. I wish to take this opportunity to thank all of the countries that have chosen not to participate. I can tell you that there are additional states which have informed me that they will not take part, but prefer not to make an official declaration. While we continue to call on all states to distance themselves from Durban, we must also continue to promote proactive measures such as the adoption of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. Thank you to all of you who have been involved in this successful effort, which has led to IRA's adoption by more than 30 states. It is critical that we continue to call for the adoption of IRA, not only by governments, but by municipalities, universities, civil society, and community institutions. Accordingly, I am now leading a campaign to have the UN adopt the definition as the official definition for all UN bodies and to have the General Assembly adopt a resolution against Holocaust denial and distortion. It is also crucial that we proactively work to repair the damage done by Durban by strengthening our ties with other minority communities in the sacred fight against racism. That is why, as Israel's ambassador to the United States, I traveled to the American South together with African American leaders in order to learn firsthand about historic and contemporary challenges of racism. Dear friends, whatever happens at the UN this week, I know that I can count on you to continue to be partners in the fight against anti-Semitism in all its forms, against racism in all its forms, and for the rights, legitimacy, and security of Israel and the Jewish people. Thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Jon Voight is an Academy Award-winning actor, producer, and director with almost 50 films to his credit. Among his many honors, he is the recipient of the Academy Award for Best Actor, 2 Golden Globe Awards for Best Actor, and the Cannes Film Festival Award for Best Actor. His courageous efforts to speak out against intolerance, racism, and anti-Semitism have earned him admiration from around the world. In 2019, he was awarded the National Medal of Arts. His heartfelt social media videos confronting some of the most pressing challenges of our times garner hundreds of thousands of views. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Anne. Thank you for putting all this together. I know it's hard work. The demonization and the delegitimization of Israel are shocking to me. These phenomena reveal a profound misunderstanding and lack of knowledge about the Jewish people and about Israel. This has been a concern of mine for many years. People ask me over and over, what is this attachment you have to the Jewish people? And my answer is this: the Jewish people have given mankind the perfect tools for living. They've given us the teachings of the great Torah, which, if followed, bring us to peace, love, courage, wisdom, and justice, and all that the United Nations was founded to stand for. Zionism is philanthropy, a belief in helping others, a belief in life and freedom. It is belief in God and good. Moreover, those who fabricate the poisonous lie that Zionism is racism believe in death and killing. I visited the victims of suicide bombers in Israel. I've looked into the faces of those who've lost loved ones, witnessed the deep harm done to the children of Israel living in the path of repeated rocket fire. And I'm outraged at those who make excuses for this barbarism, who manufacture the propaganda of Palestinian victimhood, who refuse to recognize that this anti-Semitism is capable of destroying the Jewish nation. It is the duty today of all good people, of all faiths, to express outrage and demand truth be heard. And I'm so grateful, therefore, to Anne Bayefsky and these righteous warriors of truth who have stepped forward today to confront and expose this evil force. God is represented in the testimonies and the warnings of each of these people. So thank you, Anne, for asking me to be part of it. I'm very grateful for everything that you do. Much love to you, and God bless.
The Arab delegates talk of racism. It lies not in their mouths. What has happened to the 800,000 Jews who lived for over 2,000 years in the Arab lands, who formed some of the most ancient communities long before the advent of Islam? Where are those communities? What happened to the people? What happened to their property? The Jews were once one of the most important communities in the countries of the Middle East, the leaders of thought, of commerce, of medical science. Where are they in Arab society today? You dare talk of racism when I can point with pride to the Arab ministers who have served in my government, to the Arab deputy speaker of my parliament, to Arab officers and men serving of their own volition in our defense, border and police forces, frequently commanding Jewish troops, to the hundreds of thousands of Arabs from all over the Middle East crowding the cities of Israel every year, to the thousands of Arabs from all over the Middle East coming for medical treatment to Israel, to the peaceful coexistence which has developed, to the fact that Arabic is an official language in Israel on a par with Hebrew, to the fact that it is as natural for an Arab to serve in public office in Israel as it is incongruous to think of a Jew serving in any public office in any Arab country, indeed being admitted to many of them. Is that racism? It is not. That, Mr. President, is Zionism.
Dr. Alan Kadish is president of Touro College and Touro University. The Touro system is the largest Jewish-sponsored educational institution in the United States, currently educating approximately 19,000 students in 35 schools throughout the world. A distinguished scholar, academic, and administrator, Dr. Kadish joined Touro in September 2009 from Northwestern University, where he was a prominent cardiologist on the national stage. Dr. Kadish, thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Professor Bayefsky. As it approaches its 50th anniversary, the Touro College and University system continues to strive to fulfill its dual mission: to preserve the Jewish heritage and to fix gaps and fill gaps in education where they exist. Today's Durban Counterconference helps fulfill both missions. We continue to fight anti-Semitism, and there are many areas of misinformation where additional education will be helpful. In some ways, we're in an unusual place in the world today. On the one hand, Israel now has peace treaties with several Arab countries that it never had before. This represents progress in integrating Israel to its rightful place on the international stage. On the other hand, anti-Semitism throughout the world continues to rise, fueled in part by the lie that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitic. At the Durban Conference, the United Nations continues to propagate the misinformation that Zionism is racism. Touro College is proud to stand with the countries that are boycotting the Durban Conference and with the speakers at today's conference in combating these lies, in helping make sure that anti-Semitism remains something that we fight together and hopefully recedes into oblivion. I'd like to thank today's speakers, Professor Bayefsky, and all of you who are listening in the important mission to fight anti-Semitism and racism. I hope you all enjoy the conference with me. Thank you.
Andrea Levin is the Executive Director and President of the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America, the organization she has directed for 30 years. CAMERA, the oldest and largest Middle East media monitor, has pioneered a unique mix of academic level research and public activism to combat false information about the Jewish state that distorts public policy and fuels anti-Semitism. Her columns and articles, and those of her organization, which has expanded internationally to include Spanish language, Hebrew, and Arabic media, appear regularly in publications across the United States and around the world. Andrea.
Thank you, and welcome to all who are joining us today to deliver a resounding, emphatic, unequivocal message of repudiation of the evils spawned by the Durban Conference and all it signifies. The luminaries speaking today are a truly remarkable gathering of the righteous, and we are deeply grateful for their voices. To Anne Bayefsky, who has devoted herself heart and soul to this event and made it all possible, enormous thanks and appreciation. CAMERA is proud to be a co-sponsor, and I want to say just a few words about why we, a media monitoring organization committed to fighting lies about Israel, are involved. We exist because we know that when the media fails to tell the full truth, the public is misled, along with policymakers, and many dangerous consequences can follow. There is no more blatantly malevolent major institution where Israel is concerned than the United Nations. And that reality is almost universally obscured in media renditions of the statements, judgments, votes, events, and policies of the institution. Were it otherwise, if the New York Times, say, which so often appends egregious caveats to the statements of various Israeli leaders, were to provide warranted caveats when citing yet another UN censure of Israel, or were it to actually investigate and honestly expose the grotesque bigotries of anti-Semitism of Durban, the public would comprehend that the UN is immoral and biased. But most of the major mainstream media are totally silent, not only about the ongoing travesty of endless hectoring of the Jewish state with false charges, but about the grotesque events of 20 years ago at Durban and the ensuing campaigns that grew from that conference and have spurred the delegitimizing of the Jewish state. Rather, those efforts to recast Israel as a racist, settler, colonial outpost have found willing, unquestioning megaphones in many of our most influential media. And here's another linkage of today's focus and camera's mission. Right now, we have a huge billboard in place opposite the newsroom of the New York Times. It reads, "Hey, Mr. Sulzberger, the New York Times apologized for burying news about Nazi anti-Semitism. Why are you burying the full truth about attacks on Jews today?" A photo of the publisher, A.G. Sulzberger, is included. Indeed, the Times has acknowledged in dramatic language its catastrophic failure to report honestly and fully on the genocide of the Jewish people in the Holocaust. Nevertheless, this powerful, agenda-setting institution proceeds to repeat its despicable past treatment of the Jews in its coverage of the Jewish state and rising anti-Semitism in America. It fails to tell the full truth about the assaults on Jews and about their assailants. It demonizes Israel time and again. In the wake of the Holocaust, the United Nations was created to stand against any recurrence of such monstrous crimes. It too, in much the same way, has abandoned its principles and obligations, becoming a forum for, quote, jackals, unquote, to assault the Jews, in the words of the wonderful late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And so, with both, we are called to act, to expose and denounce, to name and shame those who abuse their power and endanger us all, and never to desist from the fight. Thank you again to all the fighters joining us today.
Following the World War II, they resorted to military aggressions to make an entire nation homeless under pretext of Jewish sufferings, and they sent migrants from Europe, the United States, and from other parts of the world in order to establish a totally racist government in the occupied Palestine. Zionism personifies racism that falsely resorts to religion and abuse religious sentiments to hide their hatred and ugly faces. They mobilize all their resources, including their economic and political influence and world media, to render support in vain to the Zionist regime. Governments must be encouraged and supported in their fights aimed at eradicating this barbaric racism.
Secretary Michael Pompeo served as the 70th Secretary of State of the United States, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and was elected to 4 terms in Congress representing Kansas's 4th District. Secretary Pompeo graduated first in his class at the United States Military Academy at West Point and served as a cavalry officer patrolling the Iron Curtain. He rose to the rank of captain and went on to graduate from Harvard Law School. As secretary, he was a world leader in combating anti-Semitism and the demonization of Israel at the United Nations and multilateral affairs. It's a privilege to have you with us today, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, President Bayefsky, for that kind introduction, and thank you to everyone gathered today who stands ready to raise their voice against the Durban Deceit. In the 2 decades since the inaugural Durban Conference in 2001, the United States has urged United Nations member states to recognize the fatal flaws in the original Durban Declaration. While the stated goal of that document and the conference, which is now celebrating, is supposedly fighting racism and injustice, nothing could be further from the truth. The Durban Declaration is laced with anti-Semitism, and the goal of those who celebrate it is not racial equality, but the undermining and eventual destruction of the state of Israel. You know, the declaration was enthusiastically supported by terrorist leaders like Yasser Arafat, who rightly saw it not as a means to promote racial equality, but as a threat to Israel's existence. There is no better indication of this truth than the countries which the original Durban Declaration listed as perpetrators of racism. No, not China, not Cuba, nor any other bloody authoritarian regime was called out. Only Israel was identified as such. The Durban Conference in 2001 revived the Zionism is racism slur, outrageously claimed that Israel was an apartheid state, distorted the Holocaust, and made numerous Nazi analogies. It was the birthplace and catalyst of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. These things are not things the United States or any nation which values freedom and denounces anti-Semitism should be celebrating. Rather, freedom-loving nations should embrace what Israel has always been and remains today. Israel stands now, just as it always has, as the sole, truly democratic state in the Middle East. It's a diverse nation, home to citizens of varied faiths and backgrounds. Israel citizens are guaranteed freedom of religion under Israeli law and are each accorded the same rights regardless of their race or their creed. Christian and Muslim communities alike within Israel's borders are protected from attack by Israel's military and security forces. Israel is not an apartheid state, and any conference seeking to promote such a baseless assertion must be recognized for the sham that it is. I have said before that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Denying Israel its right to exist by falsely labeling it as an apartheid state is at the core of what the Durban Declaration asserts. And we all must commit ourselves to standing against such deceit. That's why, during the time I served as America's Secretary of State in the Trump administration, we chose to reject and disapprove of the adoption of the UN's annual budget, because that budget funded a conference specifically supporting the Durban Declaration and its lies. Unfortunately, that conference is happening right now. It's heartening to see that so many nations have chosen not to attend the conference this year, but it's telling who is. The United States must never support baseless slander against Israel, and we must never allow our credibility to elevate the virulent anti-Semitism which permeates the Durban Declaration. No, rather, instead, the United States should seek to build on its deep commitment to racial equality by supporting those nations, such as Israel, which stand as free and open examples to others. We should embrace not the Durban Declaration, but the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted by the United Nations in 1948. That document was informed not just by our traditions here in America, but by rights-respecting nations all across the world. We should embrace the promises of equality and freedom inherent in our own founding traditions, while remembering the essential struggles so many Americans have endured on the path to fulfilling those very promises. And we Americans must continue to stand with Israel, rightly recognizing it as a place of freedom, justice, and true equality for its people, while countering with all our strength the pernicious efforts to slander its character and undermine its very right to exist. Thank you, and God bless you.
The United States rises to declare before the General Assembly of the United Nations and before the world that it does not acknowledge
it will not abide by, it will never acquiesce in this infamous act. There will be time enough to contemplate the harm this act will have done the United Nations. Historians will do that for us, and it is sufficient for the moment only to note one foreboding fact. A great evil has been loosed upon the world. The abomination of anti-Semitism. The abomination of anti-Semitism has been given the appearance of international sanction. The General Assembly today grants symbolic amnesty and more to the murderers of the 6 million European Jews. Evil enough in itself, but more ominous by far is the realization that now presses upon us, the realization that if there were no General Assembly, this could never have happened. As this day will live in infamy, it behooves those who sought to avert it to declare their thoughts, so that historians will know that we fought here, that we were not small in number, not this time, and that while we lost, we fought with full knowledge of what indeed would be lost. The proposition to be sanctioned by a resolution of the General Assembly is that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. Now, this is a lie, but it is a lie which the United Nations has now declared to be a truth, and so the actual truth must be restated. What we have here is a lie, a political lie of a variety well known to the 20th century and scarcely exceeded in all that annal of untruth and outrage. The lie is that Zionism is a form of racism. The overwhelmingly clear truth is that it is not. The modern Zionist movement, it was, to those persons of the Jewish religion, a Jewish form of what today is called a national liberation movement. Indeed, the idea that the Jews are a race, quote unquote, was invented not by Jews, but by those who hated Jews. For a yet more important matter is at issue, which is the integrity of that whole body of moral and legal precepts which we know as human rights. The terrible lie that has been told here today will have terrible consequences. Not only will people begin to say, indeed they have already begun to say, that the United Nations is a place where lies are told, but far more serious, grave, and perhaps irreparable harm will be done to the cause of human rights. That the damage we now do to the idea of human rights and the language of human rights could well be irreversible. If we destroy the words that were given to us by past centuries, we will not have words to replace them, for philosophy today has no such words. But there are those of us who have not forsaken these older words, still so new to much of the world, not forsaken them now, not forsaken them, not here, not anywhere, not ever. The United States of America declares that it does not acknowledge, it will not abide by, it will never acquiesce in this infamous act.